happy endings are not just in fairy tales, they're real.
How has this sick child that can't even get out of her wheelchair, how has she been a part of this murder?
Since childhood, Gypsy's mother, Dee Dee, portrayed her daughter as frail, disabled, suffering from multiple illnesses, including leukemia and muscular dystrophy, subjecting the girl to life in a wheelchair, a feeding tube, and unnecessary surgeries, even having some of her teeth removed. It was all a lie.
Every single one of her illnesses had been fabricated by her own mother, Dee Dee Blanchard. And why would Dee Dee do this? Why would she make up that her child was ill? Like, who does that? Well, Dee Dee was suffering from Munchausen by proxy, and she made up all of these illnesses for her daughter Gypsy because she wanted attention and sympathy from others. And Gypsy, throughout her whole life, like not just her childhood, her whole life, she was subjected to terrible abuse from her own mother. So Dee Dee was actually born Claudine before changing her name, and until recently, not much was known about Dee Dee's upbringing, her childhood, what she possibly went through. The only thing we did know is that she was a bit manipulative, she was a liar, she was stealing things, like she was just getting into trouble for like small things. So first of all, Dee Dee from a very young age was by her own father, Claude. He would take her into a room on her own. It was quite often his little workshop, like it was a little shed. It was not a part of the main house. And he would her. So that was the first huge revelation about Dee Dee's childhood. So when Dee Dee was born, her mother, Emma, said that Dee Dee had a whole host of illnesses. And one of those illnesses was a heart murmur. And no one other than Emma, the mom, was able to verify that Dee Dee had these illnesses. It was just Emma saying, oh yes, Dee Dee has this illness or Dee Dee has that illness. But because Dee Dee apparently had these illnesses, her mother Emma would now go on to completely smother her and isolate her, protect her from the world. For example, whenever Dee Dee's siblings would go outside to play, Dee Dee was never allowed to. She was not allowed outside with the other children because of her apparent heart murmur. She was never allowed to run around with the other children because she couldn't sweat. She couldn't exhaust herself because of her illnesses. She could never do any chores because she would get too tired because of her illnesses. And things got so bad that her mom would never let Dee Dee leave her side. She was also forced to sleep in the same bed as her mom. And Dee Dee was essentially spoilt, and she was the favorite child. And over time, Dee Dee grew to really love this attention. At this point, Dee Dee is 24 years old, and she enters into a relationship with a 17-year-old boy. He is a minor. So after Dee Dee starts a sexual relationship with a child, she soon falls pregnant, and Rod, he's only 17 years old. He's so young. And he also comes from a pretty religious, conservative household. And he has been raised to think now that Dee Dee is pregnant, there is no other option but to get married. So that is exactly what happens. 17-year-old Rod and 24-year-old Dee Dee, they got married pretty much straight away. But 6 months later, before Dee Dee even gives birth, Rod wakes up. He's now 18 years old, and he realizes that he's made a big mistake. He doesn't love Dee Dee. He doesn't want to be married. So this is when the couple get a divorce before Dee Dee even gives birth. And then on the 27th of July, 1991, this is when Gypsy Rose Blanchard is born. So after Gypsy is born, Dee Dee takes her home, and initially everything is fine. At this point, Dee Dee is living with her parents. She's still living with... So it was around when Gypsy was approximately 3 months old. One night she was sleeping, nothing was wrong, but Dee Dee noticed that Gypsy had stopped breathing, and Gypsy was rushed to the emergency room. It's actually pretty common for babies, especially newborns, to maybe have some problems with their breathing. So when Gypsy is rushed to the emergency room, the doctors can't find anything wrong with Gypsy. Like, nothing is wrong. However, Dee Dee is convinced that there's something wrong with Gypsy. So she starts telling everybody that Gypsy has sleep apnea. So that was the first medical condition that Gypsy had. But then it wasn't too long after this that Dee Dee noticed that Gypsy started to have problems with her eyes. Her eyes weren't focusing on things. They weren't aligned. So Dee Dee took Gypsy back to the doctors for this eye problem. And this is when Gypsy Rose was diagnosed with a condition called strabismus, a condition where one or both of the eyes are not aligned and they're just pointing in different directions, and it can be quite serious if not fixed very early on, because it can eventually lead to complete blindness. And I just want to make this clear that Gypsy Rose Blanchard did have this condition. This was 100% legitimate. This is pretty much the only legitimate condition that Gypsy had. Everyone was concerned about Gypsy. And because people were worried about Gypsy, they were giving Gypsy, and then by extension, Dee Dee, attention and sympathy. So Gypsy went on to have surgery. The surgery went well. The problem with her eyes was fixed, and there was nothing more to worry about. However, it turns out that this one legitimate health condition most likely triggered a dramatic change in Dee Dee. As soon as people found out that Gypsy did have this serious condition with her eyes, Gypsy and Dee Dee started to get attention and sympathy from pretty much everyone. But then as soon as Gypsy's eyes were fixed, that sympathy and attention went away. So it seems like from that moment on, Dee Dee made the decision that she would make sure that her daughter Gypsy was constantly sick. And it is thought that this is the point where Dee Dee Blanchard's Munchausen by proxy started to set in for the very first time. Dee Dee started telling everyone that her little baby, she had leukemia. She's going to have to go through chemotherapy because she's got cancer. So naturally, everyone was giving Gypsy and Dee Dee sympathy, attention. And this is exactly what Dee Dee wanted. She even started shaving her daughter's head to make everyone think that she was going through chemotherapy, and she lost her hair through that. And as soon as it started to wear off, all of a sudden, Gypsy Rose developed a chromosomal defect that caused all three: asthma, epilepsy, and muscular dystrophy. But what is even worse is that at this point, Dee Dee actually manages to convince some doctors that Gypsy is suffering with these conditions. And then now Dee Dee was rubbing her hands together, because she would, wouldn't she? She's actually convinced doctors that her daughter is suffering with conditions that she doesn't have. And now that she has her hands on medication, these cause a whole load of side effects to Gypsy. This medication would make Gypsy drowsy. She started having trouble balancing, walking, and these side effects did make other people believe that Gypsy genuinely did have these conditions. One more thing that she wants to do to make her daughter Gypsy look like the ultimate sick patient, to allow her to have more control over her daughter. And that was, she wanted Gypsy in a wheelchair. But Dee Dee, she bided her time. She knew that she needed to go about this in the right way. She wanted to come up with a plan that was plausible. And then one day, fate seemed to work out for her. And Dee Dee was handed the perfect excuse of why Gypsy all of a sudden ended up in a wheelchair. Because one day, roughly 6-year-old Gypsy Rose got into a motorbike accident with her granddad. Now, this was not a serious accident, but then it's still a motorbike accident. So it still was serious, but it wasn't serious at the same time, if you know what I mean. Gypsy only had a few scrapes on her leg, like a little bit of a cut. It wasn't a big deal at all. But as soon as Dee Dee found out that Gypsy had been in a motorbike accident, she completely blew it out of proportion. And Dee Dee wrapped Gypsy's leg up in a complete bandage. Like, I'm talking full on leg bandage. Dee Dee returned home with a wheelchair. And she told Gypsy that she would need to use a wheelchair until her leg healed. But that's the thing. Gypsy would now never leave this wheelchair. And Gypsy is absolutely devastated. She just doesn't understand why she has to stay in a wheelchair because she knows that she can walk. And then there is another really significant thing that happens in Gypsy's life when she is 9 years old. And that is that her grandfather, Claude, would start to her. So Claude, as we know, he said his own daughter Dee when she was a child. Well, now he was about to do the exact same thing to Gypsy. So in some point in early 2001, Dee was involved in a very serious car accident. She suffered a terrible injury to her leg and she had to stay in hospital for 2 months. So because Dee was in hospital for 2 months, this now meant that Gypsy was put in the sole care of her grandfather, Claude. So whilst Gypsy is in the care of her grandfather, whilst Gypsy is in their care, she never gets out of her wheelchair because she has been so brainwashed by her mom to never get out of her wheelchair. But every single day, Claude would take Gypsy out to his workshop, which was that separate building away from the main house. Once inside, he would take Gypsy out of her wheelchair before performing acts on her. His response was, quote, "No, I never. That's not true at all. Gypsy was actually the one that would try and touch me." And this is when Gypsy and Dee moved approximately 2 hours north to the city of Slidell, Louisiana. And whilst living in Slidell, Gypsy would now grow from 10 years old to 14 years old. So they're there for 4 years. Gypsy had cancer, asthma, epilepsy, muscular dystrophy, she was in a wheelchair, and there was a few other little issues. So because of all of this, Dee already had a lot of control over her daughter. How am I going to have even more control over my daughter? I know. I'm going to control her food. So this is when Dee decided to take away Gypsy's ability to eat food. And we all know that food is a huge factor in having control over somebody. So Dee comes up with a new illness that Gypsy has, and that is that Gypsy has a phobia of eating. And this is actually a legitimate phobia. It is called cyberphobia. Cyberphobia? I don't know if that is how you pronounce it, but it is a legitimate phobia. But Gypsy doesn't have this phobia. My daughter, she has this phobia of food. She won't eat and she's not taking in enough calories through the mouth. What can I do? I think we need a feeding tube inserted into her stomach so I can just feed her whenever she needs to be. Doctors now agreed and recommended that Gypsy undergo surgery to have a tube inserted into her stomach that would now give Dee the ability to feed Gypsy through that tube directly into her stomach whenever she needed to. And we now get to another significant chapter of her life, where her life was about to be turned upside down, and it would be because of Hurricane Katrina. In the summer of 2005, Dee and Gypsy were still living in Louisiana when Hurricane Katrina hit, and it completely devastated the community that they were living in, as well as a lot of other communities. And during Hurricane Katrina, Dee and Gypsy were forced to move into a shelter for about a month and a half before they were able to return to their home. But then when they returned home, there was pretty much nothing left. It had completely been destroyed. They were only able to recover a few of their belongings and they needed a new place to live. And this is when Dee started to take advantage of her daughter even more. Because after Hurricane Katrina, news reporters descended on the area trying to get stories, trying to report on the devastation, what people's lives were like after the hurricane. And this is when Dee essentially shoved her daughter in front of the cameras, literally saying, look at me, I have an incredibly sick child. She has leukemia, asthma, epilepsy. She's got to be in a wheelchair all the time and we have nothing left. But she was also saying more lies lies to try and get even more attention. She started saying that her daughter had a very short life expectancy, and it worked. Because of course it did. To the outside world, this was a horrible, devastating story. No one wants to see anyone homeless, especially an incredibly sick child. So Gypsy ended up in newspapers. She started appearing all over the place. She almost became a little mini celebrity. And then following this, a lot of charities started to get involved. A lot of people picked up on this absolutely devastating story of Dee Dee and Gypsy. So charities started sending Dee Dee and Gypsy to Disneyland, to trips here, there and everywhere, paying for flights, paying for accommodation. Dee Dee and Gypsy were attending events left, right and centre. In fact, charities started even paying for Dee Dee and Gypsy's accommodation, like permanently, because they had nowhere to live. And they moved to a few houses, but their rent was always paid. And then one charity even offered to build Dee Dee and Gypsy their very own home for free. And this home would be customed for Gypsy and her needs. And over the next couple of years, as their home was being built, Dee Dee and Gypsy continued on attending charity events. And Gypsy became kind of like a role model in the community. Dee Dee would always dress Gypsy up in princess dresses to make her look as young as possible, but also as cute as possible. She would always train Gypsy to act in a very childlike way, speak in a very, very high-pitched voice. She would always encourage Gypsy to act a lot younger than she was. So everyone would talk to Gypsy like she's a little kid. And this would frustrate Gypsy so much. Gypsy just wanted friends. She wanted a boyfriend. She just wanted to be a teenager. However, now we get to when Gypsy is aged 18 years old. And this is where things started to change, because Gypsy got her very first friend. And this was a girl, 18-year-old Aaliyah, who was a neighbour. And Aaliyah was such a kind, sweethearted girl, and she befriended Gypsy, even though she thought that Gypsy was 4 years younger. So the two of them start hanging out, and Dee Dee allows this. And this is when Gypsy Rose starts to become rebellious, because now that she's friends with Aaliyah, she starts seeing how a normal child, a normal teenager, should live. Aaliyah was allowed to go to school. She was allowed to have friends. She was allowed to use the internet. She was allowed social media. She was allowed a boyfriend. And Gypsy was so envious because that's what she wanted. And at this point, Dee Dee and Gypsy had a laptop in the home, but Gypsy was only allowed to use a laptop to go on children's websites, probably a lot of Disney websites, because Gypsy was really obsessed with Disney. It was kind of an escape for her. But one night, when Dee Dee was sleeping, Gypsy crept out of the bed that they shared, and she creeps to the laptop. And she would now stay on the computer for hours every single night in secret. She actually made a secret Facebook profile, and she started talking to Aaliyah online, and they started talking about a lot of things, like just normal teenage things. And this was the first time that Gypsy's eyes were opened to the outside world. She's now 18 years old, and she's only just starting to learn about the world. So Gypsy had this small taste of freedom. But then one night when Gypsy is on the laptop, Dee Dee catches her, and Dee Dee is so furious. She actually goes into the other room, picks up a coat hanger, and viciously starts to Gypsy. And now this is the first of many times where Dee Dee would now physically her daughter. She then dragged Gypsy back to bed and told her she was never allowed on the laptop ever again. So now we get to 2011. Gypsy is currently 19 years old, even though to the outside world, she is only 15. And one day, Gypsy and Dee Dee go to a sci-fi convention. And this trip really would change everything. Gypsy went, she was all dressed up. So Gypsy at this convention, she's talking to a lot of people. And when Dee Dee's back is turned, Gypsy starts talking to a 35-year-old man called Dan. And Gypsy found this man attractive. And Dan asked her if she had Facebook, which obviously Gypsy does have a secret Facebook account. So Gypsy was like, yeah, gave him her secret Facebook name. He said that he would look her up when he got home. And Gypsy was so excited. She was so excited that she has now met a friend in the real world. So she goes to the laptop and she saw that Dan had sent her a friend request. And over the next few months, Gypsy snuck onto Facebook every single night and spoke to Dan over Facebook. And Gypsy has said that the relationship was, quote, charged. So over time, Gypsy started to trust Dan and she started to open up to him about her life and about the way her mom treats her. And at some point over these few months when she's talking to Dan, Gypsy actually does find her real birth certificate. And this is when it first got revealed to Gypsy that she's actually 19 years old. So Gypsy now tells Dan that she's 19 years old. So then Dan says, well, you're an adult. You're free to go. Why don't you just leave? So this is exactly what Gypsy does. At 2 a.m. one evening, Gypsy sneaks out of bed, packs a bag, takes some money, and walks out of the family home. Because remember, she can walk. She doesn't need that wheelchair. And Gypsy hitchhikes all the way to Dan's home. When her mom woke up, she saw that her daughter was missing. She soon figured out that her daughter had been going secretly on the laptop, and she managed to find out who Dan was and where he lived. So it wasn't long until Dee Dee showed up at Dan's home. Dee Dee starts banging on the door, demanding that Dan open the door. She starts screaming through the door that Gypsy is a minor, that she'll call the police. So Dan opens the door and Gypsy immediately says, I know I'm 19. Oh no, what are you talking about? You're 15. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. Just trying to distract her to make sure that she never runs away again. Dee Dee ties Gypsy up to the bed using handcuffs and a dog leash. And Gypsy would be left handcuffed to the bed for 2 weeks. Gypsy actually planned to run away a few months later. She packed a bag and everything and hid the bag under her bed. But Dee Dee managed to find the bag before Gypsy was able to run away. And the two of them got into a huge argument. And in response, Gypsy picked up a gun that Dee Dee kept on her side table. A gun that Dee Dee always threatened Gypsy with. So Gypsy picked up this gun, pointed it at her mom, and shot her mom 10 times. Did she kill her mom? No, because it turns out that it was not a real gun. It was a BB gun, but Gypsy thought it was a real gun. So she only caused minor injuries to her mom from this, but it seems like Gypsy was ready to kill her mom in that moment. Gypsy has had enough and she decides to take action, and she decides to get her very first boyfriend. And this was a man called Nicholas Godejohn. So by the time we get to late 2012, this is now a whole year after the whole running away incident. And Gypsy now, unbelievably, is a 21-year-old woman. Now, over that year, Gypsy had been playing her role perfectly, trying to regain her mom's trust. And this is when Dee Dee allowed Gypsy to start using the internet again, under strict supervision. Now that there was a laptop back in the house, as soon as Dee Dee was asleep, Gypsy would now sneak back onto the laptop, go back on Facebook, look at whatever she wanted to online. And this is when she started speaking to her friend Aaliyah again on Facebook. And Gypsy would talk to Aaliyah, telling her that she wanted a boyfriend. She just wanted to be normal. She just wanted friends. And this is when Aaliyah suggested that Gypsy should go on a dating site. And this is exactly what Gypsy did. She went on a Christian dating site, made herself a profile, and this is how she met Nick Godejohn. So Nick was 2 years older than Gypsy. So he was currently 23 years old and he lived about 8 hours away in Wisconsin. And Gypsy and Nick hit it off immediately. Nick shared with Gypsy that he had autism spectrum disorder, and Gypsy shared with Nick all of her illnesses. And Nick said that he would be there for Gypsy, that he would protect her from anything, that he would be her knight in shining armor, her prince charming. And this is exactly what Gypsy wanted to hear. Because after they had been talking back and forth for a few months, this is when Nick started to reveal his darker side. Nick started to tell Gypsy that he had multiple personalities. He had a good side, he had an evil side, but he also had a dark side, and that was the side of him that he now wanted Gypsy to meet. And it turns out that Nick did have a dark side, because only a few months prior, Nick was actually arrested for watching in McDonald's, and I'm pretty sure I read that he was also in public at the same time. Nick also started to say that he was into role play, very aggressive, and the two of them enter into a more relationship. However, Gypsy, she didn't really want to be doing this. This was not her thing. Like, she didn't really like this, and this was not her idea of what love was. But Gypsy's point of reference for love. So one day, Gypsy and Dee Dee are planning on going to the movie theatres to see the new Cinderella film, because that was something that Dee Dee and Gypsy did quite often. They would go to the cinema a lot. So this is when Gypsy thought to herself, this is where I can bump into Nick, and this is where we can meet. So Nick makes the bus journey from Wisconsin down to Missouri. Gypsy was going to dress as Cinderella, and she tells Nick to dress as Prince Charming, which he does. And in March of 2015, this is when Gypsy and Nick meet face to face for the first time. And when Gypsy laid her eyes on Nick, she was so overwhelmed. This is everything that she has ever wanted in her life, especially because he's dressed up as Prince Charming. But she's got to keep it cool. And then at some point in the movie, Gypsy goes to the bathroom, and Dee Dee allows Gypsy to go to the bathroom on her own. And then not too long after, Nick also goes to the bathroom. And then in the middle of the movie, the two of them, Gypsy and Nick, go into one of the bathroom stalls to have. Gypsy naively thought that her mum might be happy for her. And Gypsy, in response, for the very first time, started to rebel against her mom. This was the final straw. She actually started to administer more and more medication to Gypsy to try and keep her under control. But Gypsy just kept rebelling more and more. And Gypsy was ranting to Nick over Facebook, telling him about everything that her mom was doing to her, that she needed to be free from her mom. And this is when Nick said to Gypsy that he would protect her from anyone. And Gypsy replied, "Even my mother?" And this is when Nick's evil side comes back out. Nick actually said that his evil side, his evil personality, would take care of her mother. And this is when she sent another message which simply read, quote, "Would you kill my mother for me?" Because almost immediately, Nick agreed to Gypsy's plans. Gypsy also records a home video showing the layout of her home, so she can send this video to Nick, so Nick knows the layout of her home and knows where her mom, Dee Dee, will be. And this video that Gypsy records is so chilling, because when Gypsy gets to their bedroom, Gypsy goes over to the bed and she points to the bed where her mom will be sleeping. And then she starts to make stabbing motions on this recorded video. Back at the Blanchard household, Dee Dee and Gypsy are getting ready for bed. And as soon as Dee Dee is asleep, Gypsy messages Nick that she's asleep and everything is good to go. So Nick soon arrives at the home. And as soon as he arrives, he says, quote, "That is dead." Nick is wearing a pair of gloves. He is holding the hunting knife that Gypsy stole from Walmart, and he instructs Gypsy to go to the bathroom and shut the door, which Gypsy did. She went into the bathroom, she shut the door, and she covered her ears. And this is when Nick crept into Dee Dee's bedroom. He got on the bed, which awoke Dee Dee. Dee Dee saw Nick, and she screamed out and said, "Who are you?" Before Nick replied with, "I'm your nightmare," before he lifted the knife into the air and brought it down and stabbed Dee Dee. And after this, Nick just launched a frenzied attack. Dee Dee rolled onto her stomach, and now Nick repeatedly stabs Dee Dee in the back. And Dee Dee is screaming for her life. Gypsy is in the bathroom and she has her ears covered, but she can hear everything. She can hear her mom's screams. And at some point during the attack, Dee Dee screams out for Gypsy. She screams out Gypsy's name. She asks Gypsy for help, but Gypsy just sits there in the bathroom. And this is when Dee Dee Blanchard lost her life. Nick then went into the bathroom and he told Gypsy that the job was done. And now everything goes a little bit crazy because Nick, he is exhilarated. He is on a high. And he goes back into Dee Dee's bedroom. And according to some sources, this is when Nick contemplates having with Dee Dee's body.
Hi, honey. I'm feeling it.
They stay in the motel for a couple of days and then the two of them make their way back to Wisconsin to Nick's home. But they didn't want to take the murder weapon on the bus with them. They thought it might be too risky, just in case if someone searched them or something, they didn't want to have a murder weapon on them. So the two of them decided that it would be safer to mail the murder weapon back to Nick's home. Yeah, they literally get the knife, they put it in an envelope, they write Nick's address on it, and they put the murder weapon in the post. So then the two of them arrive back at Nick's home, and the whole fairy tale that Gypsy had built up in her head soon came to an end because things with Nick were not how she thought that they would be. Because as soon as they got to Nick's home, Nick started to become incredibly controlling. He started to tell Gypsy what she could wear, what she could eat, what she could watch on TV, how she could act. And this came at a huge shock to Gypsy. Gypsy realized in that moment that she had just gone from the arms of one abuser, her mom, into the arms of another one, Nick. Because how Nick was being with Gypsy once they were back at his home really reminded her of her own mother. And Gypsy is living in Nick's home for the next 5 days. And over those 5 days, Gypsy is trying to look at the news, see if her mom's body has been discovered, but it hasn't. But Gypsy is not happy about this. She actually feels incredibly guilty at the thought of her mom dead in her home and no one has found her. So what does Gypsy do? She goes to Facebook and she logs into her mom's Facebook account and she makes a post on Facebook, which is now a very infamous post relating to this case. And she simply posts on Facebook, quote, "That is dead." And Gypsy chose those exact words for a reason. And why did Gypsy post this on Facebook? Well, she wanted someone to be alarmed enough about the post to call the police for the police to then go out to the home and find her mom. So it didn't take long for police in Wisconsin to surround Nick Godejohn's home because they thought this was an active killer. He could be armed and dangerous and he possibly has kidnapped Gypsy. So the police have surrounded this home. They are shouting for Nick to come out of the home, for Gypsy to come out of the home because they think that Gypsy is in there as a victim herself. And then after about 20 minutes, Gypsy is the first one to leave the home. And oh my God, the shock waves that went through the community because Gypsy Rose Blanchard walked out of that home. This was not what the police were expecting. They were expecting to find a child or a very young woman that had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old, couldn't walk, needed a wheelchair, and they couldn't believe their eyes that Gypsy Rose Blanchard was actually a 23-year-old woman and she was walking. Nick soon follows and both of them are arrested. The police started digging through Gypsy's medical records. They found multiple birth certificates that had 3 different dates of birth There was one that said she was born in 91, which was obviously the real one. Then there was another one that said 93, then 95. They found out that Gypsy never had cancer, that she could walk, she clearly didn't need a wheelchair, that she didn't have any of the illnesses that she claimed to have. So when the police go into Gypsy, she knows how to act. She's had to act her whole life.
Well, Gypsy, we are here investigating something, so I do need to talk with you about some things, okay?
I'm thankful because I have no idea why I'm here.
Okay.
Nobody will tell me anything.
Yeah, that's fine, and that's kind of why we're here.
So she pulls out her best acting skills, and the police say, "So Gypsy, your mom is dead."
You need to be honest with me, and if you're involved in anything that I'm about ready to tell you, then you need to tell me, okay? Your mom's dead, okay? Your mom's passed away, okay? And she's deceased, all right? Now, what I want to ask you, did you have involvement in this? Okay. Just, hang on, listen to me for just a second.
You stabbed her 4?
Yeah, 4 times.
Okay.
The 4th one, I felt it go into, I think it might have been her lungs.
Okay.
Because it was harder to get out.
And then when Gypsy found out that Nick was giving a full confession, this is when Gypsy also confessed to her part in the murder. And in this moment, because Gypsy was so naive to the way the world worked, she genuinely believed that she wouldn't be in trouble. She wouldn't actually face a prison sentence because she wasn't the one that actually stabbed her mom. Preparations were being made for the trial, and it looked like Gypsy could get a very lengthy prison sentence. She could possibly be going away for the rest of her life. But in the end, because this is such a complex case, there is literally no precedent for this case. And because there are so many mitigating factors in today's case, the state decided to only charge Gypsy Rose Blanchard with second-degree murder. And in the end, they arranged a plea deal with Gypsy that if she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, she would be given 10 years in prison, which is exactly what Gypsy did.